Welcome to our St. Andrew's community and to this time of worship and reflection on the day we call Good Friday. This time will include music from members of the St. Andrew's Choir, prayer, readings, a meditation, and poetry. We hope that it will help you to enter more deeply into this important moment in our journey of faith, and also give you strength in the midst of all the challenges we face in these days. And so let us come before God now in prayer. Let us pray. O God of infinite love and power, we gather together on this Good Friday to reflect on Jesus' passion and death. We are utterly humbled in the presence of such love and mercy. Open our hearts this day to the goodness of Good Friday, and fill us with your love and powerful spirit of holiness. Remove from us all sin, and offer us anew this life in Christ that makes all things new. Amen.
This is a reading from Isaiah, chapter 53, verses 1 to 12. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked, and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. This is the word of the Lord.
A reading from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer. By night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me, they shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Yet it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. O you, I was cast from my birth. And since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls encircle me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me, like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs are all around me. A company of evildoers encircles me. My hands and feet have shriveled. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far away. O my help, come quickly to my aid.
A reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verses 27 to 50. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink, mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he wants to. For he said, 'I am God's son.'" The bandits who were crucified with him also taunted him in the same way. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last.
Well, it's Good Friday, friends, and it's a difficult day for many people. We're not together as we usually are, but Bob and I thought that we are in our own homes, but we thought we might just have a bit of a conversation between ourselves that you're all welcome to listen in on, just about what Good Friday means and how do we understand this, how do we interpret, how do we process, how do we live in this Good Friday moment. Both as individuals, and as a church, and in a world in which there is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear and a lot of difficulties that people are going through. I think we all know that Good Friday is one of those celebrations is not even the right word. It's a commemoration that is filled with a tremendous number of different nuances and meanings and messages for us. We've probably all known the theology, which is large in the idea of Christ as the one who is somehow ransomed, or the one who bears all the sin of the world on the cross for us, thereby allowing forgiveness to take place. And there have been, as you can imagine, countless theological tomes written about the theology that emerges out of that. And it's a very complex theology. Other people have talked about Christ as the scapegoat on the cross, the one who somehow took upon himself as an innocent victim all of the blame that we so often attribute to each other. And there's a whole theology about that one too. But I thought perhaps today, Bob and I might just reflect back and forth a little bit about what does Good Friday mean to us now? What does Good Friday mean to us this year, in this time, in this context, in this circumstance? It may not be the same next year. It may not be the same 2 years from now. But what does Good Friday mean to us now? So, Bob, for you, what does Good Friday mean to you this year?
Yeah, well, I'm reminded and taken back in time a little bit to the time I spent in Mozambique in the late 1980s and early 1990s in the midst of a civil war, and being present with the church in Mozambique. And Good Friday was one of the most important days in the church year, and the services that were held were massive, and they were often had to be outside because people couldn't fit in the church. And I think it reflected the sense that people had of the identification with Jesus' suffering in what they were experiencing, which was in war and in extreme poverty, and often not really understanding why this was happening, especially for people in the church. Why were they subjected to this suffering that just seemed to keep going on and on? But somehow, in the telling of the story of the crucifixion on Good Friday, there was an identification that Jesus had experienced this kind of suffering, that God was present in the midst of suffering. And it's something that we recognize perhaps more in our own lives when suffering comes, whether that's on an individual basis, or there's a member of our family who's dying or is sick or going through a dreadful time, or a more communal experience as we're going through now with this virus, and our questions about how can this be happening? How can the world come to a halt almost through this virus, and that it brings untold suffering to so many people and disruption in the life of individuals and the life of the world.
It's a really interesting thing to think about. I think against the backdrop of Psalm 22, which is the common psalm that's read on Good Friday, and we've read it today, but also that was the same psalm that Jesus himself quoted on the cross. That sense, my God, why have you forsaken me? That sense of God forsakenness. That I think probably people who are in times of extreme suffering can relate to in a really, really powerful way. It's also interesting, I think your Thursday night Bible study group has been taking a look at this, and so many of the Lenten readings leading into the stories of Holy Week remind us that Christ seemed to be the only one in his community of friends who seemed to be aware that he was walking into a really, really difficult situation, and actually asking them to follow him into a very, very difficult situation. So every time that he came and said, we're going to Jerusalem and it's not going to go well, he had that glimmer of hope that 3 days later I'll rise again. But the disciples didn't, they couldn't comprehend a Messiah who knew ahead of time, it seems, that he was heading towards suffering, not towards acclamation and celebration. And it was almost he was walking into that trauma, knowing full well that he was walking into that trauma and willing to do it, which is
I've been reading, as part of my work with Rainbow Communion this year, reading a book by Serene Jones that's called Trauma and Grace. And she has done a lot of research in the area of trauma and post-traumatic distress. And she says that really when you read the Bible, it's a series of traumatic events that people then have to respond to, whether it's the story of the people of Israel in slavery in Egypt, in the exile in Babylon, in the story of the crucifixion and death of Christ, and this is behind that story, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the end of the life of the temple. So all of those things were incredibly traumatic in the life of Israel. And the Bible is, in a sense, a means of making sense out of that, or telling the story. It doesn't take away the trauma, but it brings it into a context and into a way of talking about it that can make some sense in the lives of people. And, you were talking about Psalm 22. Most of the Psalms of lament that are people saying, why in the world is this happening? How can this be happening when, our God is with us? come back in the end to a remembrance that, yes, God is present, even in the midst of suffering.
Yeah. That's one of the other really important, I think, theological movements of so much of Good Friday is, and something I don't think we talk about nearly enough, the concept of redemption. That there's something that a God who can somehow be present with us in the midst of suffering, can be present with us in trauma, and not empty the trauma and the suffering of the pain and the agony and the loss and the sorrow that it is, but somehow can still, it's like the story of Job. Job never gets the answers to why he had to suffer, but somehow his calling out to God led him into a deeper awareness that God was still present and was still showing up in the midst of it. And that Florence McGregor, who's one of the members of our congregation, gave me a book, it's not unlike the one that you were mentioning, called Resurrecting Wounds, and about sort of the after effects of trauma against the backdrop of the cross, and against the backdrop of the fact that even after the resurrection, there was still wounds. There's still wounds, and somehow that woundedness shouldn't have to happen, but can become a powerful reminder that there's redemption that can happen in the midst of it. But that's part of the story later than
yes.
we're at
Well,
right now.
and it's as we tell the story, and as we move through the weekend and from the cross to resurrection and the stories of resurrection, it's in retelling the story. It's in people having the courage to talk with each other about what's happened, and being honest about what's happened, that there's some kind of way of getting through and coming out in a different way, and an affirmation again of faith and of possibility of new life.
Yes, and one that emerges out of being a willingness, I think, as Christ himself demonstrated for all of us, to turn towards the storm, to be aware that the uncertainty and the fear and the anxiety and the God-forsakenness and the Gethsemane moments of, if it be your will, take this cup from me, because thanks very much, I would really prefer to go a different way on this one. But that too is part of that journey towards the cross, and then becomes, I think, prelude to good news. But let's not jump too far ahead of the story. We have to be.
We're still at the beginning of the psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's where we are on Good Friday, and really in the experience that we're going through right now, we're asking that question in so many different ways.
Yeah. And seeking God, I think that's the important thing. I don't want to jump too quickly to the joy and the hope. I think that there is the seeds of new community that could emerge in the aftermath of this. I think there is a greater kindliness and neighborliness, and I've 7:30 every night. We live in an apartment just not too far from High Park, and we're surrounded by apartment buildings. And to hear people coming out on their balconies at 7:30 every night and banging the pots and just we're together in. I think in some ways the cheers are part of the lament. But at the same time, there's a transformation that could be happening.
Well, and so we move from here, through the weekend and through this situation in which we find ourselves, and that the world finds itself. And we cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? But we also trust. Somehow that God is with us and present in the midst of all of this.
Yeah, into your hands I commend my spirit was also uttered in that same moment.
Yes.
So. God bless you.
God bless all of you.
Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure. Then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die.
Mein Gott,